Like most jazz beginners, I started out making jazz chords much too complicated, a mistake that I also see 90% of my students make. But once I discovered Joe Pass' method for chords, it changed the game completely and tied everything together. So in this video, I'm going to show you how he simplifies jazz chords so that they are easy to play, easy to remember, and a lot easier to use in real songs. Joe Pass has one rule for jazz chords.
You must look at chord changes really in the simplest way you can look at them.
But what are those simple chords, and how does that help you learn to play beautiful jazz chords? Let me show you. When you first got into jazz guitar, I bet it was those huge, beautiful chords with lots of color that hooked you. The ones that make you stop and say, whoa, how did they do that? So like me, you probably dove into chord books and started memorizing one complicated shape after another. But each chord has its own name, its own diagram, and its own weird fingering. And before long, you were drowning in a sea of chords and diagrams. So here's the problem. Nobody, not even the pros, can remember thousands of separate chord shapes. And when you're playing jazz, it's not just about knowing all those chord grips. It's about moving smoothly from one chord to the next and making the music flow. And that's impossible if you're piecing together random shapes. Instead, you need to start grouping chords together. Think in families, not an endless chord menu. What I'll show you makes everything easier. And there's a bonus. This approach is the shortcut for chord solos, the thing that seems like quantum physics if you're stuck thinking one chord at a time. I'll show you how it works and bust 3 huge misunderstandings that are holding back jazz beginners. We're not jumping into chord solos or fancy chromatic tricks just yet. Let's start with a classic G7 13. You've probably seen this shape before, but what can you really do with it? So here's the secret. Instead of grabbing the whole 4-note grip, strip it down to the essentials, just like Joe Pass talked about. Make it simple. Focus on the heart of the chord, the 3rd and the 7th. For G7, those notes are on the middle string set. Why does this matter? Now the G7 part of the sound is really just those 2 notes. The 13th, it's just an extra flavor. It's nice to add in there, but you don't really need it to make great music. And the bass note, leave that to the bass player. That frees up your fingers for other fun things. Most guitarists are used to finding chords by hunting for roots on the 5th and the 6th string. Instead, what you want to do is visualize the root, but only play the shell, the top part. So try this. Play a 2-5-1 in C major. Think about the complete chord with the root, but only play the 3rd and the 7th. Hear how clear and smooth that sounds? You can do this for any chord. Keep those 3rd and 7th notes on the middle strings because that leaves you space above for melodies and extensions, and space below if you want to add a bass note or even some walking bass. So now you've just ditched one of the biggest jazz chord misunderstandings, and you've got a super simple way to play any chord. Next, let's deal with another myth, and then I'll show you a hack for chromatic passing chords that makes them ridiculously easy. Here's the second big misunderstanding. Chords are not just isolated islands, they are always in a context, a song or a chord progression. A G7 is not just a G7, it depends on what is happening around it. Peter Bernstein puts it perfectly.
It's really about dealing with the chords as they move in this time, in this form, in this tempo. That's why chord scales, if you're thinking about something like that, you got to think about, okay, E flat 7, but which E flat 7? Where in the form are we?
The most important part of that movement is melody, but adding melody is not that difficult now that you've already reduced the chord to 2 notes. I'm first going to show you how to find notes that work and then talk a bit about how to create melodies. Let's break down how you actually add melody to your chords. Think of it like this. You've got the G7 shell, so the 3rd and the 7th on the middle strings. Now all you need to do is look at the top strings and see what other notes from the G7 scale that you can add on top as long as they fit with the sound of the chord. Now instead of thinking, is this a G7 13 or a G7 with a 9? Just think of it as a G7. It's a spot where you can play a melody using all those notes. And I'm just calling all of them G7 because that's really what's happening. Now, my point with writing G7 doesn't mean that you should not know what the extensions are. It's just to make it clear that when you see G7 like this, then you can use G7 with a 13 or with a 9. G7 is not a specific chord, it's a category. Just like saying something is a pasta dish, it tells you something about it, but you can still have a lot of variations. You can do the same thing for D minor 7 and C major 7, just add notes above the 3rd and the 7th, but pick the ones that work. So for example, I'm leaving out the F on C major 7 because it doesn't really fit with that chord. But you'll also figure that out if you start working with it, if you try this out. Don't be afraid to trust your ears. Like this, you're not stuck memorizing a million shapes, you're actually making music, and you're doing it in a way that's flexible and creative right from the start. Now that you have the basics down, your chord shells and some melody notes, it's time to actually turn those chords into music. So here's an example that might sound a little bit busy, but I also want you to see just how much is possible when you start adding melody to your comping. Try taking a chord progression or a song that you know and experiment with improvising simple melodies on top of your chords. Don't worry about getting it perfect, just explore and see what sounds good to you. If you're comping behind a soloist, here are 3 things to keep in mind. Play mostly stepwise melodies. Don't play too many notes or too many chords. And make sure to once in a while clearly lay down a long chord on a heavy beat. Now this third misunderstanding is one that I see pop up in comments all the time.
You should never play chords on the downbeat.
Honestly, that is just not true, and you won't hear any real jazz musicians say that. Now, of course, you want to learn to play off beats, but you're also there to support the music and the soloist, and sometimes you just need to lay down the groove and make things clear. And there's nothing wrong with hitting a chord on beat 1 or beat 3. Sometimes that's exactly what the song needs. Your offbeats only sound good if they're balanced with some solid downbeats. It's like cooking with only pepper and no salt. It just doesn't work. Let's move on to a visual hack for chromatic passing chords, and then we'll start looking at some chord soloing. With this approach, you can see how chords really just boil down to 2 notes plus a bunch of melody notes that you're free to improvise with. At this point, what you play is more about hearing a melody than worrying about complicated chord formulas, extensions, or alterations. But jazz melodies often use chromatic notes too, and you can add these into your comping very easily. The simple way to look at a chromatic passing note in jazz is that they create a bit of tension by landing on a note that's outside the chord or the scale, and then resolve by moving up or down a half step. For example, on the G7, if you play an E flat between E and D. So you have this melody over a G7. Now the first chord is probably going to be this G7 with a 13, and the last one is just going to be this regular G7 with a D in the melody. Now for the E flat in the middle, you don't need to invent a brand new chord here because it's resolving down to D. So if you take the voicing that you play on the D and then play that under the E flat, you have a chord that resolves perfectly down to that note, and then you have this. You can do the same thing going up, so let's say that you're moving from G to A and you're adding a G sharp as a passing note in between. Now here you can use an F sharp shape to move up to the G7. It's both easy to figure out and easy to play since you're just thinking about where the melody resolves and moving your chord shape to match it. There's no need to overthink the passing chord itself. You don't even really need to know what chord it is. Put this together and you can play something like this. Here's something cool. When you improvise with your chords while comping, you're actually learning to play chord solos, maybe without even realizing it. You're already making phrases and melodies using these simple chord shapes. So the next step is really just to use them as a solo, not just for backing someone up. Let's take a different example. So instead of the 2-5-1 in C major, let's look at a blues in G. Now for the first 4 bars, you already know the G7, so all you need is a C7 to make a solo statement. Start with a basic C7 like this. Then you of course reduce that to just 2 notes, and then find a practical set of melody notes. With these notes, you can easily play a chord solo like this, and notice how I'm repeating riffs on the C7 and using chord response to really connect the melodies. This This approach is super practical and you'll hear it all the time in playing of greats like Joe Pass. If you want to see more, check out this video where I break down chord solo phrases and some amazing jazz blues from Joe Pass himself. It doesn't get any better than that. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.